So yeah, I believe that we can go ahead and get started. For those of you who were hoping that she would be here in person like me, unfortunately we had a little COVID situation with her roommate, and she at the last minute had to appear virtually, which is sad because I was really looking forward for all of you meeting her in person because she's an amazing can I use the word spunky? Is that too? A young journalist who has already done great things in a pretty short time, and I'm impressed, and I think she's going to continue to do great things in the future. Can we all just welcome Amal and thank her for being here?
So yeah, like Sarah mentioned, this is a story that I wrote for the Texas Observer. It was sort of the last big feature I did there before I left to freelance, and I'm going to talk you through the story and we'll get into all these details. But essentially what I was looking at was this massive build out of export facilities for oil and gas on the Gulf Coast and trying to really capture, what the impact was going to be for the folks that live closest to these plants. These are a lot of environmental justice communities. And yeah, the thrust of the story really just is trying to tell those stories in a holistic way so that, the sort of broader audience in Texas understands like what's really happening on the coast. In a lot of ways, these are very like isolated areas, I think, from big cities. So, that was sort of part of the challenge. And okay, so we can just jump right into it. For those of you who haven't read the story, I just want to quickly kind of take you through, again, some of the stats here. So what I really focused on here is sort of the spine of the story, right, was liquefied natural gas production in Texas is set to like quadruple, right? So there are 2 existing facilities in Texas that export this fossil fuel. There are a couple of oil export facilities, but both of those were set to just increase by orders of magnitude. So that was the first thing that I was looking at. And, secondly, that building these facilities, the 5 or 6 that are being permitted in various stages, it's really going to be detrimental to the ecology of the coast. These are, again, regions where people rely on things like tourism and fishing and, oyster reefs and all of that. And all of that was sort of at stake here, right? And to me, like looking at this story when I first started, it really seemed like the coverage up to, maybe started looking at this in the spring of 2021. What we had like in terms of news coverage was a lot of focus on the financials of these plants. You've got all the big players. So you've got like Exxon, Chevron, ConocoPhillips, like all of these big companies and their investments. Like that's what was really being reported on. But I just felt that there was no focus on like who is living near these plants, like what's actually going on in the places where these are being built, right? So I'll take you quickly through how I found this story that I ended up telling, right? I think it's sort of an interesting one because I really stumbled onto it, right? Like this was not something that I came up with sort of on my own one fine morning, right? Like what happened was that I actually got a press release from a legal aid clinic that I, had a relationship with already. I had done some reporting about their legal cases, and their lawyers are just really, really excellent at, representing environmental justice cases. So I was on their press list, and I got what I thought was sort of an interesting press release about a very specific channel dredging project, right, for one of these facilities that I ended up writing about in a town called Freeport. And a channel dredging project for, it's a little technical, I guess. So essentially there are, ship channels that bring in these giant tanker ships that, take out exports from everything, right, like from chemicals to fossil fuels to like other products. Like they might be like importing things like cars and fruit and stuff like that, right? And they were planning to dredge out this channel, make it deeper so that they could fit these giant tankers that are even bigger than the ones that they're already using. And those were mostly for the oil export facility. So I decided to just attend the webinar, see what was going on. Again, like these are lawyers that I really think are doing excellent work. So I was like, I think if they're involved in this, there must be something there, right? And the town itself was one that I had reported from, and I knew that this was a very industrial town and that it was also an environmental justice community. There's a lot of, working class, lower income folks that live really close to these polluting facilities, and folks are always sort of having to fight against that, right, for cleaner air and water. Sat through the webinar and kind of quickly realized that, okay, I don't think the one project itself is really worth a story, right? But what I kept hearing during that webinar was that this was just one project out of a bunch of others, right? That this was not actually all that unique, that there were a couple of other things going on up and down the coast. that folks had their eyes on, and like they were in communication with other communities where this was happening. And so that was really what caught my eye, right? Like those were some of the key things that I was hearing in that webinar that really launched this story. So my initial questions that I kind of walked away with wanting to learn more about, right, was that I had heard a little bit about some other big industrial projects for, fossil fuel exports. How many more were there? Where were they happening, right? Everyone was talking about liquefied natural gas in this. I actually did not really know what that was at the time, right? Like this was the first time that I really reported on this type of fuel or commodity. Two, like, why are these projects happening, right? Like, why in Texas, and like, why in general, right? Like, what's the market for it? Like, where is this going? All of that, right? And three, I think this ended up being the most important question, right? Which is, how do the local residents who live closest to these and are going to have to live with the impacts of these facilities being built out? How do they feel about these projects coming to their community, right? So those three questions are really what drove everything else that I'm going to talk about in this presentation. So the first thing I want to show y'all, this is a map from the Maritime Administration, right? So it's an agency in the federal government that permits the offshore oil facilities that I talk about in the piece. So this is just kind of an example of, this story involves looking at a bunch of different government agencies, and, there's so many different folks that are involved in like permitting and reviews and all of that. So this is just one of them. As you can see, it's a whole list of all the applications, the ones that are already approved and being built, the ones that have been decommissioned, the ones that have withdrawn permits, like all of that comes from this government agency. And this map shows you the little triangles near the Texas coast. Those are the two that I ended up focusing on in this region. And this is a similar map from the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission. So again, like this is the agency that, has all the data about the permits for the LNG facilities that we talk about. Again, you can see the ones that are already approved, not under construction, and the ones that have like had their permits withdrawn. So there's a whole cluster of them. And as you can see, it's not solely limited to the Texas coast, but, me being based at the Texas Observer at the time, that's what I really wanted to focus on. And the ones that are sort of on the other end of the Gulf Coast, weren't really in my jurisdiction, I guess, to report on, right? Trying to keep it Texas focused. So this is the this is actually the road trip map that I ended up, when I did this big reporting trip, I ended up driving about 800 miles from Dallas, started in Port Arthur, which is a very heavily industrial town near the Texas-Louisiana border, and drove all the way down to Brownsville, made all of these stops, talked to people along the way, got to see some of these facilities that were already built up close. In the case of Brownsville, got to see the very pristine landscape that was going to be destroyed for these projects. So I wanted to show you this because, when you look at the final product, you're like, oh, of course it makes sense that you went and you did all this reporting from the field. But I did have to sort of convince everyone involved, right? That it was worth it to send me on this 800-mile road trip. I had to put a lot of work into showing my editors hey, I think that, there's something here, right? I'm talking about these big trends, and these are environmental justice communities that I care really deeply about, covering correctly. And I think that being there in person would make this story much richer, right? Travel is expensive, right? That's why we roped in people like the Pulitzer Center and Institute for Journalism and Natural Resources to fund some of that travel, which was really great. And yeah, the initial part of the pitch was really convincing everyone that I needed to be there and to see the folks in person and kind of see things, from their perspective. And it was a lot of fun. I will say, one piece of advice before we move on, I packed all of this into 1 week and I learned my lesson. Next time, ask for more time, right? It was certainly a lot of reporting in 1 week, but yeah, we'll get into sort of what that brought to the story in a bit also. So this is a quick overview of the sources that I relied on for the story, and we'll talk about each of these more in depth. I mentioned some of the government agencies that I was looking at already, and I also mentioned Lone Star Legal Aid, the legal clinic that helps sort of intro me into this story. So those are the connections at legal aid orgs are really important, I think, because, these are the folks that are very, very well versed and sort of immersed in the technicalities on the ground. They're often representing challenges against permits or other things, right, to help communities, fight for cleaner air, water, whatever, right? So Lone Star Legal Aid was a big one. Environmental Integrity Project was another big one that I relied on. Their lawyers are, I believe, based mostly in DC and Austin, and I think, but I think they have like networks across the United States, and they're just a very generally like well-respected, group in the environment world. And so I think a lot of y'all might find that you rely on them as sources. Other, environmental groups, Earthworks, Sierra Club, advocates, there were a lot of local chapters. I was in touch with the national representatives, like kind of the whole spectrum, because they were also very, this is a big sort of focus for them, right? Fossil fuel expansion and trying to slow that down or stop it, right? Obviously talked to researchers, places like the UT Energy Institute, these are the folks that are tracking a lot of these big trends in fossil fuel expansion, the economics of it, all of that, like all of that explanation really came from the academics who like spend a lot of their time thinking about this. Government data, obviously really important. So, EPA, the Environmental Protection Agency, FERC, MARAD, as I mentioned, the Environmental Information Administration, and then some state agencies as well. The last big thing that was actually really important for this was the environmental impact statements. And we'll get into what that means, what that is. Yes. Okay. So these are federally required studies for major projects like these export facilities, right? So essentially any facility that's going to bring a pretty substantial amount of pollution or like impact to the region, they're usually going to require some sort of federal permit. And that's when, a government agency is going to issue an impact statement. And what they're going to do is look at all of the potential sort of scenarios, right? So like building the project, not building the project, building it somewhere else, right? Like they'll kind of detail the different scenarios, and they'll talk about why they chose this particular site and this particular, all of the things that are sort of in those applications. They'll outline the whole project. So it's really useful. They're kind of a gold mine for like figuring out what something is and like what the potential impacts could be. They're very dense. They're like, usually 700, 800 pages. So learning to skim those is definitely a skill, right? And I think I looked at maybe 10 or 11 of them for this story, and, your eyes start to glaze over, but they're very helpful. I think the other important caveat here, though, is that a lot of times community stakeholders might disagree with the findings of these reports, right? Keep in mind that these are done through government agencies, and that means that sometimes there are folks on the ground who say things like, well, they didn't consider this, they didn't consider that. Like, someone in DC doesn't really understand like what we're living through in the kind of context of our community, right? So you might hear things like that, and it's really important to figure out how to balance, an official government document with what you're hearing on the ground, right? Like there's always going to be some tension there. So just something to keep in mind as you're looking through these. And the good thing about these reports is that they are public records. They are publicly available from whatever agency issued them. So in my case, it was usually the MARAD did a couple of them, FERC did a couple of them, Army Corps did one of them, right? You might have to ask for them though. Like it might be really hard to actually find it on the website. Government agencies are not known for building the easiest, most accessible websites, I think. So if you can't find it, you can usually just email a press person at the agency, right? Like if you find staff contact, whoever does like their news communications relations, right? Like they're going to send it to you, which is really great. Here's an example of one of those. So this is actually the first couple of pages from the impact statement for Rio Grande LNG, which is one of the plants in Brownsville. So as you can see, there's a bunch of different agencies that were involved with this, right? From EPA to the Department of Transportation, Coast Guard, Army Corps. They're all sort of looking at different aspects of this, right? And it's interesting because if you're sort of interested, Fish and Wildlife Service, for example, was involved in this. So if you're interested in something related to like maybe habitat conservation or a particular species, endangered species or something, like all of that is included because those agencies are looking at their kind of particular thing, right, in those. And so the page with that text, that kind of shows you, the EIS kind of outlines everything that plant is going to be doing, right? So you have that all in like one document, and it shows you like what they're building, where they're building it, all of that, right? Which is really helpful when you're starting out, like just to figure out what and get a handle on like what is this that they're building, right? That they keep talking about. Another source of information that I found really helpful Energy Information Administration and the Department of Energy. So they have a ton of data on all things energy, right? So coal, oil, gas, renewables, like you're going to find a bunch of information about things like consumption, production, like all of that, right? Export data for me was really helpful, obviously. So this screenshot there is from the Department of Energy. They have a whole series called LNG Monthly, and every month, it's a little bit delayed. Like I think right now it's November, and they might have just released like September data. So it's a little bit behind, but generally very useful to have sort of the most up-to-date official data, right? And this, they track kind of what's being produced in terms of liquefied natural gas and like where it's being shipped. So you can actually track like from, for example, from Corpus Christi, like X number of tankers went to Korea, X number of tankers went to like Spain, right? You can actually track it. Like it's very granular, which is cool. I didn't end up using all of that obviously in the story, but what was really helpful for me was that this data helped contextualize, right? Like you can see the sort of massive increase over the last, from 2016 to today, right? And I was able to contextualize like, well, this is where we are now, and this is where all of these facilities together would put us in about 5 years, right? Which is this massive expansion, right? If all of these get built. So being able to contextualize that growth was really helpful. I will say that I didn't know that this data set existed before I started doing this reporting, right? So some of it is just stumbling around, figuring out what's there. Like you might have to do a lot of extensive Googling, and then you'll find stuff, that has like the DOE.gov, website. Also, like I mentioned, talking to the academics is really helpful because that's what they rely on, right? So they might be able to set you in the right path, right, in finding these data sets. So a good thing to like ask researchers and stuff is like, what data sets do you use that might be helpful for me, right? The main state agency that I dealt with on this story was the Texas Commission on Environmental Quality. And again, kind of similar to why I wanted to pull the export data, right? I wanted to show the pollution impacts we were already seeing. So that, again, there are 2 facilities that have been built. There's the Corpus Christi liquefaction plant, and there's one in Freeport, Texas, right? So people who live near these plants say all the time, like they violate their air quality permits daily, right? Like we can smell it, we can see it, like, there are flares that get lit, like all of that. So if the government agency that's supposed to control the air quality, like permits this and is supposed to find them, isn't doing that job, right? So that was something that came up in the story, right? Like even the fines that TCEQ is issuing in these cases are not really enough to incentivize these companies to kind of clean up their act, right, so to speak. So, that's what folks on the ground are saying. If that's the case already, what happens when we have like 5 times that, capacity, right? Like what's going in the air? Like that was the main question, right? So that's what I wanted to show with this data. And it's all available at the state level, not the federal level. So you run into other issues sometimes, between state and federal, like in terms of like public records law and dealing with agencies that may or may not be as friendly, right? So this is just an example of the TCEQ data that I pulled up. So this is from Corpus Christi's liquefaction plant. And so these are all the incident reports, right? So every time one of their flare stacks, they have to flare and like there's a bunch of emissions. If it violates a permit, they have to report it to TCEQ. And so once you click on one of those incident reports, it lists out every single compound that they emitted, right, in excess of their permits. So it's pretty, it's pretty toxic stuff, right? So you can see there's obviously a lot of climate emissions, right? There's a lot of methane that comes out of these plants, volatile organic compounds, carbon monoxide, all of that, all of these things are just not pleasant really to be around and breathe in. And that was something that I didn't really, it's one thing to hear about that and kind of know the scientific thing, but like when I was on the ground reporting and like you could smell it and see it yourself and like you start to get the headaches like 2 hours later, right? Like that's when you really start to understand just how bad a lot of this is. Okay, so that was a lot of lead up to kind of tell you and show you like what I did before I ever left Dallas, right? So all of that information was stuff that I was sitting at my desk, making phone calls, like on my computer all day long, right? Pulling these reports. And all of that sort of helped me before I ever embarked on field reporting, right? So kind of knowing the scope of things and the stake of things and the technicalities, right? And then I was able to go in person, talk to a lot of folks and figure out, their side of things, right? And figure out from their perspective, like all of this information that I have, like how is it actually, relevant to your lives? So these are 2 of the folks that were in the story. So we have John Beard from Port Arthur, who is an environmental advocate. And he actually used to work at one of the Exxon plants in Port Arthur, right? He was a long time, I think, like process engineer or something like that at one of the plants, and kind of came to realize like just how destructive this was for his community and even for himself personally and his family, right? And has sort of turned to environmental activism now. And on the other side, we have Diane Wilson. She's a longtime environmental advocate as well in Matagorda Bay, where one of the oil export facilities is being built. And she's actually a shrimper. I think she's like a fourth generation shrimper. So her livelihood really depends on being able to go out on a boat, harvest, all of that. And that was what's at stake in Matagorda Bay, right? Like a lot of the fishermen were very upset that like these facilities are going to be destroying kind of the best areas where they go and catch things, right? And tourism was a big thing too. Like people come down to Matagorda to fish, right? So all of that is what was at stake. And they are just two of the people that I was able to, talk to and get that perspective from. So I wanted to map out for y'all how I found folks that I talked to, right? I think that's sort of the hardest part, right? So we have the Rio Grande Valley, which is all the way south, Texas, Brownsville, right? And then Freeport. So I mentioned earlier, like the Freeport connection was also from the legal aid folks that I was already sort of following their work, right? But the Sierra Club was also doing some work there. So from my press contact at the Sierra Club, she was kind of head of the Texas general press stuff. And then she actually moved on to the national level. But, I had worked with her a lot to get sources in my previous reporting. And so I knew that, like, if I emailed her, if the Sierra Club was involved at all in any of these, like, she would know exactly who I needed to talk to, right? So, she did. She recommended that I talk to a woman named Becca Hinojosa in RGV, who'd been working on LNG facilities for a very long time. Like, this is like 7 or 8 years there, right? Because, again, these plants take that much and longer to get permitted. So she had been on the ground doing that for, like, almost a decade. So she knew everyone that had any connection to this, right? And so when I went down to Brownsville, she organized, every person that I talked to kind of ended up taking us on this like long car tour of the city. Like we drove around to multiple spots, right? And Becca did that as well. And she actually had different stops where different people were meeting us, right? So I talked to another local shrimper in Brownsville, other organizers, other environmentalists, folks who were like living closest to the plants, like they were all kind of along this massive car tour that Becca organized. And it was just really great to be able to like go to a place, talk to someone, about the importance of that place to them, standing there and thinking about like what was going to change, right? Melanie Oldham in Freeport again, like she is another longtime activist, and she connected me to the retired industry scientist Cindy Jordy, right? And so we got to talk about, from her perspective, like working in the industry, why some of these permits didn't look correct to her, right? Again, this is someone in the industry saying, like, I don't think that this company is doing things correctly, right? There were some other groups too that didn't make it into the story, but I think helped kind of round out for me the background of this, right? Like there's a pretty sensitive turtle habitat in Freeport that was going to be impacted. So there are a lot of other, things that are going on here that was just really interesting to hear about from the perspective of locals. Another map, I won't go through this one as in detail, but it's kind of the same thing. Environmental Integrity Project, as I mentioned, a really great resource. So their lawyers connected me to, in this case, the plaintiffs that they were representing against some of these permit challenges. And those folks connected me to other people, right, when I met them in real life. So it's just kind of this web of like, figuring out who's sort of centrally maybe managing some of this or like working on this, and they'll connect you to other folks, right? And I would say too that having having a contact at sort of an organizational level is really helpful, because it can be really hard to just immediately go to the person on the ground, right? If you aren't already familiar with that, right? Like I had no connection to Port Arthur before this, right? Like I grew up in Dallas, like it's like 6 hours, 5 hours to Port Arthur. Like I had never been there before. I didn't know anyone there, right? So just like thinking like Googling and Facebook, like that might work, but it's a lot more hit or miss, right? And then the added layer of like, you want people to trust you before you send them a message or just cold call them, right? And so talking to like John Beard's lawyer, for example, that John was already like, oh yeah, like you talked to Colin, like Colin knows you. Great, let's talk, right? And now I'm at the point where I can call up John all the time and like ask him about stuff, right? Like I just did another piece on a permit challenge in Port Arthur, and like I just called him up directly, right? So it's one of the really nice things about having that depth in reporting is now all the stories that I'm continuing to do, like it's much easier to kind of get into that. This is the last couple of things I wanted to talk about, right? Why environmental justice was important in this story, right? And how and why I framed my story around that. So again, like I grew up in a place where I had never really seen any of this stuff up close, right? And so for me, it was also just a reminder that this kind of, heavy industry, fossil fuel expansion, like it's for a lot of us, it's out of sight, out of mind, right? Like that's happening somewhere else to other people. And when you don't really realize the stakes of like what we are kind of doing to real people, I think that's part of why a lot of fossil fuel expansion is still happening, right? Just because people aren't aware of how damaging it is and like how close it's being built to people's homes, right? So I really wanted to show the impact, on all the folks that I just talked about, right? Like John Beard, Melanie Oldham, Diane Wilson, right? Like these are real people with real lives that are going to be up, just completely sort of turned over, right? When all of these plants are built, right? Like they're worried about their cancer risk. They're worried about like, things like asthma, all that getting worse. Like all of this stuff is what's happening to them. And I really wanted to be able to talk about that, right? And not just this abstract, sometimes climate change can feel very abstract. Like we shouldn't build it because morally we know that it causes climate change. That's obviously true, but it's also a much more immediate, threat to the folks that live near it. And again, it took months and months of groundwork to be able to do that and really center that, right? To find the people that I wanted to talk to and figure out who was even comfortable talking. I mentioned that a lot of folks had ties to the industry in some form or fashion, or they had family members who did, right? So there were some people who didn't want to be quoted, who, didn't really feel comfortable that way. And it ended up being that most of the folks that get quoted in the story have sort of become, environmental advocates and were sort of thrown into this work and are comfortable being kind of the face of that community, right? And just, they're really the kinds of people that they know everyone, and so they know what the concerns are, and it kind of funnels through them. And, it wasn't, I didn't want to push anyone to talk and be on the record that wasn't comfortable with doing that, right? I think that's really important to think about in these stories. And I want to kind of, I talked so much about how much data went into this and how much of the technical stuff I had to cover. But at the same time, when I showed up to do my interviews in person, it was really important to just listen and observe as much as possible without me coming in and saying, oh, I think this is the biggest thing, right? Like, what do you think about that? Like, can we only talk about that, right? Like, it was really important to me to also just listen and figure out like, oh, like I didn't know about this thread, right? Or I like actually people really care about this part of it more than that, right? Like, or this is something that maybe happened at a public meeting that I didn't know about, but people are really upset about how that meeting went with the government agency, right? So those little moments, right? And just showing up and listening, even though I felt like I knew a lot about what was happening, right? And having sort of that ability to step back and let people tell their full stories, I think was really important. And in environmental justice reporting, I think that is something that's really, really crucial because these are often communities where nobody is showing up to listen and ask questions, right? That's often why these things are being built in certain places and not others, right? So just something to keep in mind as you try to do some of those interviews. Just to like wrap some of this up, I know I talked a lot, and so I'm really excited to like hear from y'all and get those questions. So hopefully this hasn't been too overwhelming. But just like a last couple of things. This story was really only possible because I had been sort of on this beat for a while, right? Like I'd been in Texas for a couple of years at this point as a reporter, right? Like I knew some of the sources from different projects that I had done before. I had done a couple of smaller pieces on LNG and stuff like that. So around the same time, actually, that I first started looking at LNG, I did a much shorter story about just the folks in Brownsville and a contract with a French energy company that they had successfully lobbied to kill, right? And so I'd done like things like that, where that was a much smaller thing about a very specific issue that I thought was interesting, right? But that sort of set me up to be able to do more in-depth reporting, right? And to build that background and make more connections with these different organizations, right? So I would say that, a lot of these bigger ambitious projects, like it feels like you might just be ready to jump in like tomorrow, but being able to just step back and like do all the little things first, I think is really important to the success of something that takes a lot longer, right? And also just building trust with people, right? So I talked a lot about how trust is important with sources, right? Like I want them to feel comfortable talking to me and sharing their stories. it was also really important that my editors trusted me, right? Like this ended up being a project that took me 6 months, right? So while I was working on that, there were other things that I wasn't working on kind of at the more day-to-day level because I needed to dedicate time to this project, right? And also traveling and sort of taking a whole week out of the office to do that, all of that, right? Like applying for these grants, etc., right? Like having trust with my editors was really important. And they trusted me because I had done all the sort of smaller stuff leading up to this. And they were like, okay, we think you know what you're doing. Like, are we a little worried? Yes, I'm sure they were, right? Because I was kind of like, I have this idea. It's like crazy. Just let me do it, right? But they trusted me at that point to go off and actually bring back everything that I needed to do it, right? So that's also say like just things to keep in mind as you're thinking about like the big ambitious projects that you want to do, right? Like it takes a lot of time and work to kind of get to the point where you're going to set yourself up for success with these. I think that's the last slide, so I'll stop screen sharing there. And yeah, I'm happy to take any questions on all of that.
Quick question. I was curious because this is such a science heavy issue. Were you concerned or did it weigh on you in your reporting that a scientist would read this and say, ooh, she got that one wrong?
I think I'm sort of at the point now where, one, I feel comfortable enough with some of the basics, right, to be able to explain that. Just having done some of the reporting on like things like climate emissions or like, health and pollution, all of that, right? But I also know the sources that I can ask, right? So if I'm struggling with something, it's usually not just me like reading something or a report and then putting it in a story. I'm usually doing an interview with maybe the author of the report, right? So in a lot of these, like I talked to folks who were involved in the research and whatnot, right? And got a lot of that information from them. And the thing that was good with this one, we got it fact checked. So, I had someone else who was looking at it like for all the little things. And there were some instances, one thing I remember is like I had a line in there about a cancer cluster study in Port Arthur, and the fact checker was like, I think you overstated that. I don't think we can quite say that. We had a lot of back and forth on what I was like allowed to say in the, kind of parameters of the scientific study, right? And it was just something that I had read and sort of drawn the conclusion, and it was maybe just a little bit off, right? And so having a fact checker on that, life-saving, right? But it's something that also, while I was reporting it, I was also doing that myself, right? Like making sure that everything I was saying in the story, like I had a source or I had a footnote or something, right? And keeping track of all the data that I was looking at. But it's very easy to kind of accidentally, like a lot of it is not like, oh, I want to intentionally like misstate this, right? A lot of it is just like, oh, I completely slipped my mind and I got that statistic wrong. So having someone else look at your thing is very good, I think.
Hi, Amal. I'm Adam. So I have a question, especially, I've also worked on an emissions story in the past, and I know, while translating the science is definitely one part of it, explaining why this science matters to the larger public. I know that, you touched on environmental justice issues going undercovered, and I feel like a large part of that is also just, us kind of not really having a large audience. So I just want to talk to you about what was your audience approach coming into this story? How did you kind of pitch that to your editors, and what did you kind of do to act on this to make this a story that's accessible to everyone and not just people who are in the know?
Yeah, that's a good question. Again, I kind of think of it as I think as reporters, yes, we have to be cognizant of we want a bunch of people to read something and care about it, but at the end of the day, I don't let that drive what I'm doing either, right? So I knew it was going to be complicated and technical, and I knew that there were going to be a lot of people, I'm going to be so mad when I say this, but quite honestly, she doesn't read everything that I write, right? I know that for her, it's something that makes her eyes glaze over, right? So, and that's fine. I think it's good to have people keeping you humble, right? But at the end of the day, I want something that if you want to read it, you can, and it's going to be accessible, right? And I think translating that science is certainly part of it, but it's also just an important story in its own right, whether or not people, whether or not we get 1 million hits on it or something like that, right? I don't know if that's quite what you're asking, but for me, it was more pitching it as this is an important story because one, this is happening, and two, it matters to the people who live here, right? I think in a lot of environmental justice communities, that's kind of what I hear sometimes is that the biggest impact is just that people are so they're so excited to just see the story finally told, right? Because people aren't always asking these questions from these communities, right? And so just to have that history reported or that kind of political moment or what have you reported, I think is a really powerful part of journalism that we don't kind of always talk about when we think of impact, right? Like it's going into some sort of written record right now, right? And it's not just people on the ground sort of, talking in their own communities. Like there is a little bit of that impact, if that makes sense.
All right, Amal, I have a question from online. So we are live on Facebook, and there's a few comments and questions in here. So one is from Mark Schlefstein, who is in New Orleans, and he wants you to talk a little bit more about the EISs and how that relates to the permits. His question is, can you talk about self-imposed limits that the lead federal agencies have on what goes into their EISs? Like FERC is different from Corps and EPA, and then how that affects the permits that are written. So kind of a technical question. Yeah, what do you think?
Yeah, that's good. Honestly, hi, Mark. I follow your work too, and I feel like you probably have a better understanding of that than I do. So I feel kind of silly trying to answer that. Be honest, like that wasn't something that I spent a ton of time looking at, like the difference between different agencies issuing these. I was sort of more interested in like what they found and like how these projects were going forward, I guess, if that makes sense. So there was, at the time, there was a little more back and forth with some of this stuff out of Brownsville. The Sierra Club had sued FERC to redo the environmental impact statement. They argued that FERC had not properly kind of analyzed and done enough research on the environmental justice impact specifically, right? So they wanted FERC to redo the study, and they won that lawsuit. So FERC is having to reissue it, right? So that is something that can happen, right? Like that's why I'm saying like these impact statements are helpful, but they're not always the last word, right? Like they can get things wrong. And that's why it's kind of important to pay attention to all of the conversation around that, right? And do people feel that it was accurate or not, right?
So when you're even just like having a conversation about this subject matter with someone, or you're actually writing it in print and you have readers, what have you found that your audience resonates with the most? Like, is it the way that these industrial projects have affected, like nature? Is it the way that they've affected these communities? Like, just like, what is it that your audience cares about the most?
Yeah, a couple different things. And some of this comes from reporting that I did after, right? Like, I think a lot of folks, one, like I said, heavy industry is out of sight, out of mind, right? So I think for a lot of folks just realizing like, oh, this is like 500 feet from someone's house, right? And having those photos in the story, I think was really powerful and being able to show that, right? But two, I think I am always kind of surprised when stories that I do about like TCEQ, which I mentioned, or like other state government agencies in Texas, like those tend to do really well, I guess. Like people read that. And it's because people don't realize like how these state agencies approach environmental issues. And like a lot of times, communities on the ground keep saying like these agencies are failing us, right? And so I think stories like this show how that's happening. And I think a lot of folks who've never had to deal with TCEQ or the Railroad Commission or what have you, like don't realize what that's like, right? So I think I'm always kind of surprised by how much that resonates with people.
I have a question. So what has happened since this story was published, and how do the communities that you reported on, you said that they were glad that someone listened to their story. How did they react to the story? And then have there been any other outcomes?
Yeah, I think folks that, I interviewed, it's always a good feeling when the folks that you talk to like really appreciate and like the story. So it was good to hear that. I think, everything sort of got thrown into flux with these projects because of the war in Ukraine. So that's a huge thing now, right? Like, so Europe's natural gas supply being cut off and like threats of power crisis, all of that. Like, I'm sure y'all have heard about this. So it's actually sort of completely changed a lot of what's happened. So in Brownsville, there was a lot more optimism that some of these projects might be canceled because it wasn't clear that the market was there, right? So I mentioned that I had done a story about the French energy company pulling out of this. And that was because France had a much more kind of environmental push, right? They knew that this gas was being fracked in West Texas. The methane emissions are kind of off the charts. And France was like, we want nothing to do with that. The war in Ukraine happens, and that company actually came back and re-signed the contract, right? So the project, which the Sierra Club and the activists, all the various groups in Brownsville, they were kind of optimistic, right, that it may not come to fruition, is now kind of moving forward, right? We're seeing that with a lot of these projects because of the power crisis, right? And it's sort of a new, I guess, development on that, which I certainly had no clue it was coming. But it's useful now to be covering this issue and have all this background information, I guess.
Thank you. I wanted to talk a little bit about funding and grants, and I actually have a student here in the audience that I would like her to say a word because she also isn't part of the Pulitzer Center family and received a student fellowship last year. So I'm going to introduce Jana Rose to talk about her fellowship and just what that's like to kind of apply for and get grants for funding. And then I would like to hear you talk a little bit about that afterwards, Amal, because that is an important thing that journalists need to know how to do these days, and it can be really helpful and beneficial. So for the rest of you too, this lecture series has a related fellowship. So every year we give one or two people up to $5,000 to cover a science, health, or environmental story anywhere in the world, and you all can apply for that money. And I hope that you will. So the applications will open in the spring. Usually they're due around spring break or so. And so you can apply for that money. It can be a domestic project. It can be an international project. It's a pretty exciting opportunity. And then you get to work with the Pulitzer Center to carry out that reporting. So I'm going to ask you to talk a little bit about your project, which ended up being published, and it was amazing.
Hi, everyone. I'm Jana Rose. I am the Smith-Patterson Fellow, along with Tanishka, who's actually in India right now doing her reporting. So I applied in spring, and this was a story about my hometown, actually. I grew up next to two nuclear power plants right along the Lake Michigan shore, and then other energy facilities had been proposed through the years, and just recently two large-scale solar farms were built in this tiny, tiny, tiny town, 430 people. So I wanted to tell this story for a long time, and the Smith-Patterson Fellowship allowed me to do that. And let's see, the process, like, I didn't really know what my angle was, except for, like, there's a renewable energy build-out. Governments and private industry are putting a lot of money into this. Consumers want it. So what does this look like on the ground? And then I also really wanted to explore how it intersected with the other major industry in Wisconsin, and especially of this small town, which is dairy farming. So I think that's how we sold the story, like how energy and agriculture intersect. And as we know, not everybody wants to live near a large-scale energy facility. So I also wanted to explore why things are sited, where they're sited, as Two Creeks, Wisconsin has been now cited for a few different facilities. So yeah, through the application process, I did a lot of pre-reporting. I had formerly been at Wisconsin Public Radio, so thankfully had some sources that I just called up and said, here's what I'm thinking of exploring, and they gave me a lot of great advice. So I did a lot of pre-reporting before the application. Professor Hiles as well as Professor Kiley gave me a lot of great feedback to make that application successful. And then I traveled back home to Wisconsin in May and spent a week there interviewing farmers who are renting their land to these large-scale solar farms. Yeah, the reporting was really great. I talked to renewable energy experts and nuclear energy experts and like science researchers who are studying how people adapt to and understand new forms of energy. What I learned is that a lot of where we put renewable energy, if we're going through this energy transition, has to do with the grid. Until we redesign the grid, you need to put energy where it's already located. So those nuclear power plants being there on the lake gave these solar farms access to the grid. The most interesting part of the story to me was the economic situation that dairy farmers in Wisconsin are in. The market is changing pretty rapidly, and it's a challenging field. And this was providing managing dairies a secure source of income while other things are sort of volatile. And then I interviewed a number of retiring dairy farmers who saw this solar contract as a way to keep the land in their family, to keep the farm in their family, which is really important. So this was an environmental story, but it was also an economic story and a cultural story. And it's really great to be a part of the Pulitzer family, and this collaboration with Mizzou is wonderful. I got assigned a mentor when I was going through the reporting process, Rick Barrett of the Milwaukee Journal-Sentinel, who's excellent and was really helpful. I got to go to Washington, D.C. for a weekend and meet all of the other fellows in my class and hear about their stories from all over the world and all over the country. And yes, I think if you get an opportunity to work with the Pulitzer Center, please do so, and I hope to continue to do so as well.
Awesome. Thank you so much. And y'all can read her story. Yeah, and what's the headline of it?
It is
We Farm the Sun, Wisconsin Public Radio. So, Amal, could you talk a little bit, too, about the additional funding and grants that you have applied for? That's not a thing that journalists used to have to do a lot, and now it's like a big part of skill sets. So maybe you could talk about how you identify grants, how you get them, what they do for you.
Yeah, I think in this case, the Pulitzer Center had a specific grant for coastal reporting, I believe it was. So, it was a pretty easy pitch. Like, we're up and down the Gulf Coast, and this was the kind of story, of climate change in the coast, right? So that was how that was on my radar. There's a lot of different listservs, like if you're part of SCJ or things like that, like you'll hear about these a lot, I think. So those are definitely useful tools to hear about. The Institute for Journalism and Natural Resources also gave us a grant for this story, and I had, I think, attended one of their workshops, which are really great. I had to do one over Zoom. It was like the first one that they canceled. But they're really great in terms of most of their workshops are actually in the field. So like we were supposed to go to New Orleans and talk about a lot of different, environmental issues. So that's how that was on my radar, right? Like I knew that as a more of a training and sort of resource thing. And then they had sent out a call for pitches that come, with some of this funding. Grant writing is a little bit tricky. Like it's not really like regular writing. It's not like a beginning, middle, end. Like you really need to show kind of the impact and stuff like that you want. It's a lot of like memos, a lot of condensing the story that you want to work on down to like 500 words, right? Which is difficult. So I think in both cases, the kind of memo that we wrote talked about what made our story unique was that nobody had ever kind of nobody really had reported on the Texas coast as a whole region where, this impact is happening across an entire coastal region. There were a lot of one-off stories, from one of these cities and towns. And so the pitch that we made was that like our story is going to talk about this holistically. And I think that, we had to outline why that impact for our readers was different and important, right? So you'll be asked a lot of those questions early on. And what ended up being really useful is that we put some work into the grants, and we had, it wasn't just me, it was like my editors as well helping formulate those, which was really great. But being able to have those memos when I was kind of in the weeds of the story, like after I had done like 90% of the reporting, and I was like, well, now I have to sit down and write it, and I'm terrified. Like having those memos, I was like, oh yeah, this is what I wanted to do. Like, this is why I have all this information. And so it was actually kind of useful to be able to refer back to that. Like I already had to outline what I wanted to do, right? Yeah, and they might ask for things, they're going to ask for the typical, like a cover, probably like your resumes, all of that. Typical kind of like job application-y kind of things. But it's really writing those memos and stuff like that, which I think is a little unique.
Hi, Amal. Thanks for your time today. Paint us a picture of what it was like to make contact with some of these drilling companies that you're reporting on, like Exxon and Motiva. What was it like to reach out to them and being in contact with them specifically about this focus on just the impacts that they are having on the coast, and how do they respond to some of your questions? I think that might be useful for some of us.
It's a really good question. And I will say of the 10, 11, 12 or whatever it ended up being, like a lot of them never responded. And I think that's not unusual, right? I think that's part of the problem, right? Like a lot of big companies just don't feel that they have to justify this to anyone really, right? So they may not answer your questions. The ones that did kind of sent in these like very generic, like, this is actually greener than anything else, right? Like we're displacing coal in Asia, or we're displacing like dirtier gas in like Russia, which it's like, you have to read between the lines and figure out. They're also not answering the specific questions, right? Like I wish I could just pull it up. I don't know where the file is, but I had like a standard list of questions that I sent to everyone. And, one of those was, you say this about the project, community members say X, like how would you respond to that criticism? They just never answered that, right? Like they sent me kind of a generic statement about again, this is actually a great thing for the environment. Actually, you want to include that. You want to show the contrast. And I think it makes for a better story. Like you can show the contrast, right? Like all of that data and stuff that I put into the story contrasted with this kind of generic statement that this company gave me, right?
Hi, Amal. My name is Josie. Thank you so much for being with us this morning. I think a lot of us are really interested in science reporting and are probably going to write science, environmental justice related issues in the future. So, in your opinion, where do you think we should start? I think one of the scary things about reporting about this is looking for sources and looking for people to talk to. So, in your opinion, where's the best place to start?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, I think for me, what I've found is that, I live in Texas. I live in a state with very lax environmental laws. So there's kind of no shortage of stories. So, I think when I was first, so like my first reporting job in Texas was actually as the editorial fellow at the Texas Observer. And I came into that like, oh my God, like what happens if I cannot find anything and I'm just drawing a blank and there's like nothing for me to write about. Within like a week, I was like, there are too many emails from people who just want me to cover stuff and I'm never going to be able to get all of this, right? That obviously is, I think, a product of being at the place in the state that I'm in and like knowing that this is an issue that is like everywhere. But I think that's it's a skill that you develop, right? Like being able to spot a story, like you might hear something like maybe, a lot of times it'll be like a small local news item that I see and I'm like, that's a bigger story. They wrote the City Hall update. They wrote maybe the quick thing that, like this happened, a public meeting, whatever. But to me, I'm like, okay, these are some keywords where I'm like, I think there's something going on there, right? Like, so as you do more of this reporting, like that's where a lot of these things start, right? It's like just noticing the little things and like being curious about what's actually going on there. Is there anything else, right? So I'm trying to think of an example that I can give you maybe off the top of my head, but like, like I did a story for Grist recently when I was freelancing about a flood buyout program. And, it was just, I think it was like a quicker, like kind of news hit that I heard about this program and like how for the first time the county was doing a mandatory buyout instead of a voluntary buyout. And people were mad that they didn't have the option to like choose, right, whether or not to move out of a floodplain. And so I was like, I think there's something deeper there, right? And I turned that into like a 2000 word story, right? So it's kind of recognizing the little things that get covered, but not always the depth, I think, that they need.
Hi, Amal. This is a question for you as well as for Jana Rose. You did reporting in her hometown, but I'm curious, like, what the response was to your story. Did you hear from not only your sources, but readers, and were they generally receptive to it? Did they care? Did they hate it? I know that these kinds of topics can be divisive in certain communities.
Yeah, I mean, I think most of what I heard was sort of that folks were just like, oh, I never knew this was happening. I didn't know this was a thing, right? Like I didn't know the scale of this. So that's like mostly what I had heard. To be honest, like I'm not the best person to ask about this because I kind of think that, I don't really want my work to be dictated by the response that you're getting. Like I think if you can recognize the story and the work that's in it, like that's reason enough to do it. And I think if you get caught up in like, oh, well, people hate or love this, like that can be kind of discouraging, like, or, you start to sort of doubt yourself sometimes. And I just try not to think about that too much. Like, and again, like I mentioned, it was really important to me that the people in the communities I was writing about, like that they felt I did an accurate job and I captured that well. And I think, that's what I heard. And that was what was really most important to me.
Yeah, similar to Amal, I felt very passionately that I wanted these folks to be represented. This is an undercovered area. There's no coverage at all. And so I didn't want to say, solar good, nuclear bad, or anything like that in the story. I really wanted to make sure that the complexity of the situation was accurately portrayed. I think people were interested in talking about it. I mean, not everybody loves living by energy, and there had been some pushback in the farm communities about what this was doing to land prices. So I think I included that, and my sources shared what they had heard. I think that's it.
Thank you. All right, I'm going to ask one last question, at least for the Facebook Live portion. and that is kind of a two-part question. One, how do you sort of keep yourself going when you might feel burned out sometimes? You took an 800-mile trip. I'm sure that was exhausting, and reporting on these issues might be depressing at times. So kind of what motivates you, what keeps you going personally, and how do you take care of yourself? And then my second question is, what advice do you have for these students who are thinking about going into environmental journalism?
Yeah, I mean, I was really lucky, I think, in that the editors I worked on this story were just some of the most amazing editors I've ever worked with, right? And I think that having those be the folks that shepherded this story through, I think really made it stronger, and also allowed me the time to, take the time to do it and not try to cram it into a much shorter period of time. And also, I think when I came back, I did take some time off because my bosses were like, you basically work overtime, please don't work, when you get back. So having folks that encourage you to do that at the top is really important. If hopefully you're all lucky enough to have that. Sometimes you might have to push for that, right? But really knowing your own limits and just, writing is ultimately a creative process. And if you are tired and stressed, you're just not going to be able to do it. So I think with a lot of the writing process for me with this one was just all right, I sat down and I tried to do it for 2 hours, and now I have to go take a walk and just take some time off, do something else, right? And just let the story kind of marinate in the back of your head, right? So I think that's really important. Mental health is obviously a big thing, and burnout too. So when you sort of recognize those sources, it's important to be able to, one, recognize it in yourself, and two, if you need help, seek that or find folks to talk to kind of help you through it. I think that's really important. Climate reporting can be very depressing, but I think my approach to it is I still am in a very privileged position, and I think for me that distance helps in some ways, right? I feel like for me it helps me to think about it this is how climate change works. I have to be able to use that position to do this work, and so that separation helps, I think. But also the burnout, I think, isn't as strong for me because that's it. At the end of the day, I have the luxury of logging off when I want to. I'm not the one fighting these fights in front of government agencies every day. And that's really the truth of it is however tired I might be, I have to remind myself that other people are doing a lot more, honestly. And I don't know, that's how I think of it. That's not how everyone should or, will think of it, but I think everyone finds their own way into that.
And what's your advice for students?
Oh, in terms of just doing this work or
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think that it's important to, have sort of passion and care that you want to bring to these stories. I think it's important to find folks to work with that are going to let you bring that to the work, right? I think, I think there's a scenario, which if I was writing this for someone else or working with folks who were less comfortable with me really centering environmental justice, this wouldn't have been worth it. It would not have been worth it to me to do this story if I was working with editors who were we don't want to talk about the racial impacts as much, right? Can you tone that down? So I think recognizing when you need to step away or find someone else to work with is really important, honestly, because there are going to be folks who are not comfortable with that kind of reporting, and there are going to be folks who are comfortable with it, support you in it, and make that work better. And so finding those people to work with is really, really important.
That's awesome. Thank you so much. So let's thank them all for being here virtually. Really appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you all. Yeah, hopefully I didn't bore everyone, and I know Zoom talks can be very annoying. So thanks for bearing with me. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, no, it was great. And I wish that you could have been here in person, but this was nice. And yeah, definitely. Yeah. So I think we'll go ahead and end the Facebook Live now, but I might get you back on the Zoom just to see if any students want to have a sidebar conversation over Zoom. But for everyone on Facebook Live, thank you for being here. And Amal, thank you so much for being here. And hopefully we'll see you in person another time. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Bye.